Hey everyone, my name is Dave Sexton. This is my 7th video in my series of videos on reactive programming. And in the previous video, I believe I left you off with a challenge, if you felt like spending some time on it, to come up with contracts for the service layer, if I remember correctly. And there wasn't really anything new that we learned, so there was nothing to challenge you on that would help you repeat and practice new things. But this was a fairly sort of open-ended kind of challenge. So that's what I'm going to do today. We'll actually build the service contracts, or we'll at least start it. And I think this is a good place to do it because we started designing from the outside in, from the presentation layer into the business layer, the outer shell of the business layer. So we looked at the contracts that we need in the business layer from the perspective of the consumer, which was the presentation layer. And that allowed us to write code that we knew would be the right thing, right? We'd be building the right API. So this is an interesting state we're in now because the business layer now becomes the consumer of the service layer. So we could actually use the business layer as the consumer to figure out what contracts we want from the service. And we don't want to care at all about any arbitrary or artificial constraints that we might be tempted to place at this moment. So for now, we're going to start by just thinking about what API would be the best for us, the simplest for us to be able to communicate data to the service layer and back to meet the requirements, the specification. So remember, our goal here is to take the inputs, the business layer has inputs coming from both directions, presentation layer and the service layer, and compose them in different ways in order to implement the business rules and generate outputs. And then those outputs can be used by the service layer and the presentation layer. So we're going to try to define our observables as, in terms of the outputs that we have from the business layer as potentially as inputs into the service layer, and then vice versa, we're going to have service layer observables that will be input into the business layer, right? So additional ones, just like we did with the presentation layer. So it's similar. Okay, so let's take a look at what I left the code, what kind of state I left the code in. So we have the implementation here in the constructor of a few things. Then the presentation layer observables, and we left a little placeholder here for service layer observables, so we'll start there probably. I think the main method, I discussed maybe removing that at some point in the future, but for now it doesn't matter. Try create, these are just sort of a helper. As a matter of fact, it might be nice to just sort of move this to some other class to clean this up a little bit. Yeah, why don't we do that now? Clean things up as we notice them, right? So how about, I hate classes called utility or something arbitrary. They become these sort of monolithic types that nobody knows what's in them, and nobody knows to look in them for something that they might need. So we want to, having multiple types I think is a little bit better. So for now, maybe we call this like Uri Extensions or something. It's not really an extension. Usually with the word extension we mean extension method. Maybe I'll call it, I hate the word helpers too, because that doesn't mean, that's sort of arbitrary to me as well. I guess we can call it like URI constructor or builder, right? It's not really a builder pattern though. Actually, there already is a URI builder type, if I remember correctly. How about we'll just call it URI extensions for now. It's not that important for now anyway. We can refactor later if we notice a better name for this, or if you have any recommendations. So what are we returning here? A URI from a string, right? I think it was called try create. I could just copy that method. Let me go ahead and do that. And we'll just make it public. Okay, that's nice. And we have a little error here because we need now to have a using statement. So I could make it an actual extension method, obviously, but I really don't want to do that. I don't like doing that kind of thing because it would be on string, which means, every string is now going to have that extension. Wasn't there a way to... I thought there was a way to... using static? This is a new feature, right, in C#. I actually want to use this. I've never used it before. I'm not sure what the syntax is. Right, the class is called Uri Extensions. Isn't there a way to say... There's a way to have like a static... where like everything's in scope, right? what would make the most sense? I mean, static makes sense to me, but I don't see any other keywords that would apply here. Sorry for wasting time, but I think this would be, it's just for me, this is a learning experience. I want to use this feature. Huh. I would have assumed it would have been this. Maybe you have to type in the full namespace? I doubt that. No, because that's a type, but a using namespace can only be applied to namespaces. Consider using static, but that's what I did. Oh, but you had to type, so you have to have fully qualified, I guess, right? Because I tried this and it looked like it wasn't working. Yeah, so it had to be fully qualified. Interesting. I wonder why that is. Because we're in that namespace. Oh, but we're not in that namespace. Ah, and therein lies the kicker, right? If I do that, it would work. I'm just so used to being in the namespace, like the whole file, because I never put anything outside of it. Interesting. Okay, so good. I learned something new. So now when I do this, this is in scope, which is pretty cool. So it doesn't have to actually be an extension method, which I like, because this is going to be a very rare thing to use, and technically it's not actually an extension. As a matter of fact, this would be really string extensions, but I don't want to make this a method on string. That doesn't quite make sense to me. Try create. We could even be a little bit more explicit now, because it's not going to be clear what we're trying to create. See here now it says try create URI. We could see what the type is just from the name of the method. Okay, enough of a tangent. So back to where we were. I removed that method from here. Good. So connect, we'll get to at some point. Well, I mean, we're going to add more stuff to it probably. Reactive input and the service layer for that as well. Now let's think about what we need from the perspective of the service layer. Maybe we'll take a quick look at the spec and see if that helps at all. So I do have a section here for server design, right? So we'll ignore startup and configuration, receiving connections. So when a client connection is received, then it does a bunch of work. So we know we have to be able to send like a connection request from the client side. Otherwise, add the client subscription list, multicast a message. So obviously I have to be able to receive messages from the service. We already know what that's like because we have this here, right? When a message is received, blah, blah, blah. And then disconnection, when a client disconnects. So there isn't really much functionality here at the moment, just for at least part one of the series. We're just connecting to the server and then having two-way message passing and then potentially disconnecting from the server. So I think that's probably good enough for now. So now let's go ahead and look at the outputs that we already have here, which are going to be inputs. These are our outputs, right? These are going to be potentially inputs into the service layer. Now we have, these are definitely all outputs to the presentation layer, but are any of these also outputs to the service layer? Well, it looks like no. I would say maybe connections. Well, connections tell us, this captures the state of whether we're connected or not, and the changes of the state of the connection to the service. So this wouldn't make sense to double as input to the service. So yeah, I don't think we have anything we could reuse from here. Oh, observable of message. I remember thinking about this and I came up with a solution. My idea about message was that if the client pushes in, so if the presentation layer pushes in a message through this input, then we won't, yeah, now I remember, we won't, in the business layer, push the message into this observable. This observable will only be the messages coming from the server. So we'll only push the message to the server and then let the server ping back with the same message as part of like the larger multicast operation happening on the server side. So this will be confirmation that the message actually got to the service. That way, if you don't see your own message appear after you send it, it means it didn't. Nobody else is going to see it either, because it potentially, actually they might see it, but maybe you just didn't get it back, right? Maybe it didn't ping back to you. That's also a possibility. So that means this observable is actually representative of what's coming from the service. So technically, it's not just output to the presentation layer, right? It's also input from the service layer, right? So maybe we could use the same observable, although we have a separate type for this, so no, we'll just keep them separate, I think. So the service layer is going to be able to have message. Oh, we do have message here. Ah, interesting. This is interesting. So this message observable represents messages coming from the presentation layer. So now I'm thinking maybe because there might be some naming conflicts, we could just have separate types, like give me the input from the presentation layer and give me input from the service layer, and maybe having them segregated would make things a little easier to understand when we're reading it later. Not too much, because once we take the observables and start composing them into queries like in here, their source will be lost. So we'll have to come up with better names anyway. So I'm not sure about that. We'll keep that in mind. Maybe we will separate these to two separate input types, represent one for each layer. But for now, I don't think I'm going to do that. For now, let's just try to come up with a better name. Okay, so observable message is a stream of messages that were essentially multicast from the server. We could just call them server messages. This is supposed to be plural also. Why would this be singular? I'm not sure. That was just a mistake. Let's call this service messages, and this I will rename to client messages. Yeah, I'm okay with that. So client messages and service messages. So service messages are messages coming from the service. Client messages are messages coming from the client. We know they're coming from them because they're reactive input. So client messages being input into the business layer, service messages being input into the business layer. So that's fairly clear, I hope. So now the output for this, we need to also be able to push these client messages out to the service, right? So similar to this, we would call this client. Oh, these are actually going to be service messages, right? Service messages going to the presentation layer. And then we'll also need client messages, which are the output of the business layer from the client to the service, right? All right, interesting. So there's some duality here, it looks like, right? Between input and output. Which makes sense, right? The business layer is this sort of message passing hub, in a sense. Well, it's like a message processing hub, you know, for a layer between the presentation and the service layer to perform business logic operations. Yeah, and the service layer is really just a hub that connects all the different business layers from all the different clients, in a sense, right? Okay, so that's pretty cool. So now we also, I think the only thing we're missing then is connections, right? Being able, and disconnections. So, sorry if I'm scrolling up and down too much, it's making you dizzy. It's just habit, right? I should probably break some of my weird habits when I'm recording videos. I'm going to have to pay more attention to that, but I'll try. Okay, so let's see. Connects. Connects means that we want, from the presentation layer, we want to push in a unit to notify the business layer that we're trying to connect, right? So we'll also need input or output from the business layer, which is input to the service layer, called connects. So this is similar to like connections, which is really the state of it. Maybe we'll just change it to connection states. Right? And then this would be like connection attempts. Okay. We'll leave that for now. So this one's also going to be connection attempts. Might as well sort of keep the duality like we did with these other ones if we can, right? So connection attempts, that's good. And then, yeah, and that's very different from connection states. Oh, I forgot. I did mention that I was thinking about using task instead and doing the side effect in a subscribe call. Oh, you know what? Actually, that's true. I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner, but I probably will do that, but that's going to be deep in the service layer. That's going to be like in the implementation. We still want to think in terms of observables in the business layer. So clearly we're going to want to implement this observable in terms of the other observable inputs, just like we did before with the presentation layer. So yeah, I'm not sure why I think I might have said that a couple of times that we're going to use tasks. We're definitely going to, at some point, it's going to, at some point we're going to, even if we try to represent socket streams as an observable, internally it's easier to just use a coroutine and have tasks. So, for interoperating with sockets asynchronously in a loop, that we could then push notifications into an observable or something. So that will happen once we get to the service layer. But yeah, we're going to stay in the reactive-first world here in the business layer. Okay, so that's connection attempts, and this represents the business layer pushing in notifications to the service that a connection attempt has to occur. Now, the fact that these are different, by the way, is fairly important because, remember, the business layer we might have some rules around what to do when a connection attempt comes in from the presentation layer, right? Maybe we're going to throttle them or enqueue them for some reason. I'm just throwing out random ideas, but the idea is there could be some rules around what we're doing with these connection attempts, and it might not be business rules. It might be more like around performance rules and memory usage and that kind of thing. But regardless, having the separation means that we can now insert queries that glues this input to this output. Again, like I said, that's really the purpose of the business layer. So having the separation is good because that means now we have a place to do that. And it should be very clean, right? It should be very easy to find the rule that throttles connection attempts from the client to the server. We just go to the business layer where that would clearly be implemented and look for the query that uses connection attempts as input and produces connection attempts as output, right? So it should be a nice narrow path to figuring out where things are located in the solution that are related to those kinds of business layer problems or specification implementations. Okay, so connection attempts I think is good, and then what if the connection attempt succeeds? Then we'll want some information from the service layer back into the business layer. So there's going to be more input into the business layer. So we must have something regarding that here. Yeah, we do. So input into the presentation layer, we have connection states, right? This tells us whether it succeeded or failed, and failures. And they're orthogonal, right? So we have to consider whether we want them orthogonal or not, as well as input from the service layer. We may or may not. I mean, for different reasons, we might want it like this in the presentation layer. And, again, the business layer will be responsible for taking whatever shape of the data we really want from the business layer here as part of the contract for the services. And we'll be able to query it and reshape it in a way that fits the way the contracts are for the presentation layer based on how we actually want to consume it from the perspective of the presentation layer, right? So the business layer is sort of like an adapter in a sense, right? So for now, maybe I'll just leave it like this, but we could revisit this once we start implementing the service layer. We might realize, for some constraints or some other reasons, orthogonally that we want to change this. As a matter of fact, we might end up, once we go through for testing purposes or for performance optimizations, that we want to change the APIs slightly for various purposes. And having the separation is also very nice. We could do that now. We could change the shape of the service contracts without having to break the presentation layer. And again, that's why we're using a layered approach in the first place, right? The presentation layer is now separated from the service layer, and they could have completely different contracts, which is important. So it gives us some flexibility, right? So for now, we'll just leave this alone. I'll just copy and paste it, and we'll take a look at it again at some point. The only reason why is because I can't think of any particular reason why we might want to conflate these or keep them separate, but keeping them separate seems reasonable enough for now, so we'll do that. And let's see, Authentications is another one, right? Authentications, so this input to the presentation layer is actually a notification from the service saying that the service wants the user to authenticate, so obviously we'll need that as well. So the service layer will tell us, oh, we already have authentications. So this is actually input from the presentation layer. So why would the presentation layer require a sequence of authentications? I mean, as input to the business layer. Because when you click the send button to send your password, right, it's going to have to notify the business layer that the button was clicked and that we want to authenticate. Maybe calling it authentications, again, because of the ambiguity, isn't good enough. We'll call it client authentications. That's a nice separation here. It tells us really that the presentation layer is pushing in a notification that it wants to authenticate, and we already have the password because we have a separate observable for that, right? So instead of a string here, we have a separate observable representing the password, which we could also validate if we wanted to. I don't remember if we actually did that. Now, out of curiosity, let me just check that. No, we didn't do it. This is the only time we're using passwords. So at some point, we'll probably want to do input validation of passwords as well. It's going to be this probably the same thing as we did for this, similar, but it's going to end up just being like basically checking for a non-null string, non-null or empty string, or non-null or white space, something like that. Okay, so that looks good, and then we probably want to rename this to. I don't think I have any references to this yet, so I'll just type it in. Service Authentications. That seems good. Actually, we could call it. Yeah, I'm good with that. So there's other wording that you might find in other APIs if you didn't write yourself, or you might be tempted to use it, like request. To me, that's just as bad as like utility or helper, in a sense. It's a request. It's an observable, right? And we don't even want to care that it's a service. I mean, we know it's a service technically, but so we could think of it as like a request, like maybe an HTTP request or something. Eventually, it might be one of those, but calling it a request here is, in my opinion, maybe a little bit too, I don't know, a little bit too flaky. It's like breaking the encapsulation of the service layer to know what a request actually is. Maybe this thing doesn't get turned directly into a request, although it seems likely that it would. It would just be actually, I guess it would be this thing here, right? It would be potentially some other thing. So instead of calling it like authentication requests, I think client is better because that also separates it, and it separates it from the ambiguity of having authentication requests which could come from the service layer. So just by using the word service and client instead, we're clear now as to the direction in which they're coming from, which to me is more important. Request is just another throwaway term that doesn't really tell you anything else about the property. And also, if you put the word request here, then now the property is just a little bit longer, and I just see that as being unnecessary. So you'll see that I'm avoiding those kinds of words because I don't want to think in terms of services either, right? We want to think in terms of the specification, actually. And you probably wouldn't see the word request in here. Oh, I do have the word request in here. Well, okay, that's also because I wrote this and I'm a technical person. A business person writing a higher level spec that we still want to try to think about when we're writing the code probably wouldn't use the word request, right? So I'm thinking in those terms when I'm writing the code here. I don't want to have a lot of technical terms here that muddy up the waters. We just want to keep things semantic, right? And reading like a higher level business specification. So hopefully that's clear. Okay, so now we have client authentications and service authentication. So let me just speak about this again from the beginning just to clarify in my own mind what we're missing, because I think we're still missing a couple things. So from the outside, the presentation layer, you start by typing in some information like username, service URL, whatever. It gets validated. Nothing to do with the service layer yet. And then at some point, you want to connect to the service layer, and we'll get a connection attempts. Connection attempts. We could call it client connections. That seems a little ambiguous, though, to me. And connection attempts are only one way. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it this way. So anyway, you get connection attempts, and that is observable input from the presentation layer. And eventually will be observable output from the business layer and input to the service layer. And then the service layer either responds with three possible things, right? Success, failure, or a challenge for authentication. So if it's success, this is input into the business layer, so reactive input from the service layer to the business layer. It's going to be connection states, right? So either we'll get, is that what we were using this for? Yeah, that's right. So we'll either get a true, which now we know we're connected, right? We would not expect a false here, which would mean we were disconnected, but that would break our sort of implicit state machine. We know we can't be disconnected if we were never connected, so we would not expect a false yet. So either we get a true, which means we're now connected, which could possibly be immediately followed by a false, technically, right? It could connect and disconnect immediately. Maybe there's a race condition, but maybe somebody unplugs a network cable right as soon as it's connected, so it's possible you get a true then a false or something. But then the other option is that we got a connection failure plus a reason. This was an enum, right? Invalid username, yeah, perfect. So server error timeout, good enough. As a matter of fact, the business layer might want something more robust than this. That's actually a point that may be fairly important for diagnostic purposes. Maybe the presentation layer, we don't need anything beyond this enum, but from the business layer, maybe we want like an actual error message, something we could log, although we could probably just do that from the service layer as well. So probably not such a big deal whether we do that in the business layer or the service layer. But for now, we'll just stick with the enum, keep things a little simpler. Okay, and the other possibility is that we get an authentication challenge, which is this service authentications. So that's just a unit, no information carried in that. And that looks good. Now, from the presentation layer side, if it's successful, we know we transition to the chat program where we deal with messaging, and you can, excuse me, you can push in client messages, which then go out to the server as client messages, and are received from the server input to the business layer as service messages, and then go out. Oh, sorry, I said it the wrong way, right? Client messages from the presentation layer input to the business layer go out to the service layer as client messages, right? And then we get messages coming from the service layer to the business layer as service messages, and going out to the presentation layer as service messages, right? So that's messaging. We didn't do disconnection yet, but I'm going to take a step back and finish the connection. So that would be the successful, like the golden path, right? And then the other possibility is the connection failure. In that case, the presentation layer cleans up and does what it needs to do. And I think we're just done with the service layer at this point. We don't have to send any other messages or acknowledgments or anything. So we're good there. And then, and if, by the way, if we needed that on the service layer, or if the particular implementation of the service required that, that wouldn't be the job of the business layer, right? This is, again, high-level semantics here. That would be like a technical implementation detail that we don't want to have to know about in our queries or deal with at all. So the abstraction, the service layer, or rather service abstraction layer, will deal with that kind of responsibility of dealing with acknowledgments, whatever message protocol we end up using, that will be all in the service layer, right? So once we get a failure notification, we're done. The business layer doesn't have to do anything else with the service layer at this point. We just essentially await the presentation layer to push in another connection attempt, right? Potentially with different information here. We might get other information first, etc. Okay, so that seems good to me. And then the final thing would be the authentication. So if we do get a service authentication notification, right, we push that out to the presentation layer as authentications. Maybe for, again, sort of duality here, we'll just call it the same thing, service authentications, right? It's actually, maybe duality is not necessarily the right word. Well, maybe in here it's not. These are actually going in the same direction, right? The arrow's pointing in the same way. It's just, it's more like symmetry instead of duality. But anyway, I digress. So once we get notification that the let's say an authentication challenge, we'll call it, then the presentation layer is challenged through this observable, and the presentation layer can decide to the user could decide to cancel, right? So what do we do if we cancel? Do we need to send a message to the service that we're canceling? Well, technically, canceling is really just like disconnecting from the service, right? But how at this point the business layer, is it has tried to open the service connection. There will be some mechanism. Well, the business layer doesn't have to be stateful for that, right? The service layer can be. So, but there will be some mechanism that's like holding a socket open at the moment. So having a notification sent all the way to the service layer that we want to cancel, I think is probably important, right? So we could, in a timely fashion, actually disconnect from the service. So yeah, let's add cancellations to that as well. So this is actually going to be, actually we could technically leave that as cancellations, and then it's just also output to the service layer as cancellations. There's no cancellation coming from the service side. There could be failures, right, or disconnections, in which case we get a false, but that's not the same as cancellation. The service semantically will never have this concept of canceling the client request in a graceful way, for example. Although maybe that would make sense if you want to be really robust, right, and have something where it's like if you have to do an upgrade, you could disconnect clients. I mean, technically what you'd probably want to do is have multiple servers, so you could push all of the new requests and new connections to a separate server, and then, or move the existing ones if possible in some way, route them in some way, and then take down the server in order to perform the upgrade, and then sort of round robin them or something like that. But that's not something we're going to deal with now anyway. I just wanted to throw that idea out there that it's possible. We might want to actually have cancellations in a graceful way coming from the service perspective, but for now, I don't think we need that. Okay, so that's one option that you could cancel. The other option is that from the UI's perspective, you can just enter your password and then perform a client authentication, right? So when the business layer gets the client authentication, it needs to actually send that information to the service. So again, we'll need, let me get rid of these setters too. We'll need authentications. So we could have like connection attempts and client authentications. Client, again, just for the, maybe duality wasn't the right word, maybe parity is a better word. So we'll say to keep the parity between the service layer and the presentation layer. In this case, client authentications is the same thing, right? So input to the business layer called client authentications is also output to the service layer from the business layer. Same name, same semantics, right? Same concept. Okay. So then if the authentication fails, I presume we will just do something like this, right? Invalid password. So I think we're covered there for connection failure. Again, we're not fully connected yet, so we can just treat it as an overall connection failure. And then, like the service will auto disconnect, for example. So no need to send a cancellation request from the business layer or anything like that. And then once we are authenticated, then we'll get back a true here. So it would be as if there was no authentication challenge at all from that point on. So I think that's pretty good. That covers most of it anyway. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So am I missing anything? Disconnection, maybe? Yeah, disconnection. So how do we disconnect? Oh, we never actually did disconnection yet anyway, because we never actually implemented disconnection in the UI, if I remember correctly. I think I mentioned that we were going to maybe use like a file menu or something for that, or just auto disconnect. Like if you close the main window or something, the app stops, it will just auto disconnect from the service, something like that. Yeah, so maybe it's a good time just to just add that in. I mean, we know we're going to need it anyway, and we're on the service layer, so why not? Okay, so presentation layer, reactive input. We need some way to be able to disconnect. So let's see, we have connection attempts, cancellations, authentications. Yeah, I guess just disconnection attempts. Well, it's not even an attempt. We're going to guarantee disconnection. It's going to be a strong contract for this. Now, it might not be right away. It's best effort, but after this responds, after you push a notification in, after it responds synchronously, we'll guarantee at that point that you can assume all the state is properly adjusted in the business layer to assume that it's disconnected. The service layer might have to linger. There might be a socket linger option or something, whatever. But that's beyond our control in some cases, and we don't care about that at this high level of business layer and presentation layer. So we'll just call it disconnections. Oops. Let me just undo it. I just want to make sure I didn't, while I was talking, I didn't overwrite something important. No. Okay, so this is a new property. We're going to call it disconnections. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And now in the service layer, any kind of disconnection is going to either be accompanied with a failure message or just a false connection state change, which then could eventually bounce back to true and so on without having to re-log in or reconnect. And so like this auto connection feature or something in the service layer. That's the plan anyway. I think that's intuitive also, so most people would expect that. But from the disconnection perspective, so we don't need any disconnection coming from the service layer. So I think the input's good. As a matter of fact, I think the input's pretty well established at this point. I'm not sure there's anything else we really need to add to it, so let's just collapse that for now. And the service layer here is going to have a notification about disconnection from the client side. This is also similar to cancellations, right, in a sense. Let me put the order of these properties in a way that also makes sense. Just maybe I'm just a little bit of a pain in the ass, but I like doing it this way and making sure that top down things read in a way that's at least fairly intuitive. So first of all, you have to put in this information, then you could attempt to connect. You could also cancel at any time, so where this goes doesn't really make too much of a difference. You can't disconnect until you're connected, and that might require authentication first, so good for me. Passwords, yeah, so passwords has to happen before you send in authentication notifications, right? And messages will be obviously at the end after you've definitely connected. As a matter of fact, you can even put disconnections after messages because it's really the last thing you could do. You could be sending a lot of messages and then choose to disconnect. So anyway, again, for most people, this is probably just absurdly detailed, but maybe my OCD sometimes gets the better of me. I had to make this adjusted in a way that I like it. So from the service layer, it's similar, right? Service messages are things that happen after you get connected. Connection states first, that makes sense. Failures, fine. The order doesn't matter too much. Authentications are going to happen before you even get connected, so that should be first, and messages last. Right? This is input to the business layer from the service layer. Right? So the service might challenge you before you get a true that you're connected. Right? Or even a failure. You might get a failure actually before all of these, so this is one of those ones where it doesn't really matter too much where it's located. It could happen really in any order, but putting it after these two, because these two seem much more important. They're also the golden path, right? So I'll put them first. Okay, so that's our input. And then our observable output, we have connection states, connection failures, but authentications we know are going to happen, challenges are going to happen before we get these, just for parity with the reactive input type. Invalid usernames and service URLs, similar to like connection failures, although technically speaking, you'll get these before you even get a connection state change, right? Oh, actually, connection failures semantically you'll get instead of a true here, right? So yeah, technically this would go in front of it. Let me change that. This is one of those cases where failure isn't encoded in this. It's explicitly here, right? So it should happen before this. So whether this happens before or after authentications, that doesn't matter because there might not be any authentication challenge. So I don't really care which order this is. This feels a little bit more important to me, perhaps. This is not the golden path, so like I said, so we'll just leave it in second place. Okay, so service authentications, actually, usernames and service URLs would be first because you type them in first before you even attempt to connect at all. Then you might get an authentication challenge from the service. You might get a failure at any point. It's either connected at that point or it fails. And then you could have service messages being received from the service. Okay, so here we have connection attempts going from the client to the service. Then we might have authentication challenge responses after connection attempts, of course. Then we might have, we could also have cancellations, though, at any time. So whether that's before or after the authentications, again, doesn't matter too much. Then we could be sending our messages and eventually disconnect. Okay, that seems pretty good. So let's see. I want to go back to the specs, see if there's anything. Actually, let's check the features. Maybe there's something else we could add here. Okay, so let's see. Chat application features. Part 1. Any number of clients may open a persistent connection to the chat. Oops, trying to scroll there. Chat server. I could just read it on this side. So all messages go through the server where they are multicast to all connected clients. The service will not implement reliable messaging. It's entirely memory without any fault tolerance, at least for part 1, right? Yeah, part 1. Oops. So no third-party dependencies, blah, blah, blah. All features will be custom coded. Okay, so let's scroll down here. Client features. Filtering messages by username or search criteria. So that's interesting, right? Filtering messages by username or search criteria. So where do we want filtering to happen? I mean, it's a business requirement, so I would like to put this in the business layer. Yeah, so that's fine. So we have these observables, right? Observable of messages going in and out from the business layer in both directions. So that's where the filtering will happen. So yeah, we don't need any contracts in the service layer to deal with this. Like I said, in the future, maybe we'll use QActive to do this using queryable observables. So you write the query and it runs on the server, which would be nice. But for now, we'll just do it in our business layer. I skipped change status. This is not a service layer requirement, is it? Unless we want to. Oh, well, technically it could be if you want your status to be sent to other chat members, right? So I don't know that I actually even considered that. Do we want to be able to send the status? I don't remember. Let me look at the message type. I don't remember what I decided there. I think I didn't put status in this on purpose. Oh, actually, would that maybe it would just be, yeah. I didn't put it in this. I remember now. I didn't put it in the message type on purpose because I remember it just didn't make sense to have each message carry the current status of the user. But the user type itself, we might want the status property on. And furthermore, we might want a separate channel of messages, a separate type of message, right? Which allows us to send status changes from different users throughout the app. So that wasn't necessarily included in the spec, at least not in a explicit fashion, I don't think. Let me just search and just see here. Status. So just client features part 1. Display a list of users currently connected to the chat, including name and status. Oh, but that's part 2, right? So let me look in the spec here. Service status, presented status. So we're concerned with presented status now. If the user's status is not busy and the message matches the user's current filter criteria, if any, append the message to the message list. So this is how we're filtering messages. This is client side. This is client side business logic, right? That's interesting. I guess technically it might be nice to put this logic on the server side. Well, no, because why even send a message to the server if we're, busy or offline or something? Well, what are the statuses that we want to support? Let's look at that first. Do I have that in the feature list? I think I gave some examples. Where did I leave them? Right here. Available, busy, away, yeah. And busy will block all messages. So here's what I'm thinking. If the client marks himself as busy, then we don't want to receive messages at the moment. But does that prevent us from sending them? And I would think, of course not, right? However, busy is kind of a silly status to use for blocking messages, because busy just means, we could just use that as sort of like a semantic indicator to your chat peers that you don't want to receive messages, but maybe they have an emergency message that they want to send you. Maybe offline status will block all messages. You won't actually be able to receive any. Which is the same as just disconnecting, technically, right? Yeah, I guess this is kind of a silly feature then in that sense. So it's not about blocking messages. I remember adding this because I just wanted to have more business rules, right, where I could implement those queries. This is like a simple filter. But it is pretty, silly, I guess. I don't really like that. For, didactic purposes, I guess it's nice to have more requirements, but I don't know if it's a weird, confusing requirement, then is it really helpful? We have plenty of other stuff to do reactively. Do we really need this? I guess we don't. You know what? I'm going to change this. So busy status will not block all messages. Let's just change that. So you could change the status without disconnecting, and one of the features is that clients can receive your status. That's an interesting thing to do. Do we want to do that in part 1, though? That sounds like a part 2 thing to me. Yeah, display a list of users currently connected to the chat, including name and status. Yeah, it sounds like I was already kind of thinking of doing that in part 2. So you know what? We're just going to delete the requirement that the status blocks messages if you choose busy. So where's that? Including name and status, and then this is the second one, yeah. And then in the spec, presented status, receiving messages. If the user's status is not busy and the message matches the user's current filter criteria, let's change this to offline. That way I don't have to change this entirely. How about that? There's a little compromise. Busy was just a weird status to use, I think, for this. It's more semantic. Offline will be literally, I'm on an important phone call or something and I don't want any message pop up. Or like I'm doing a presentation and I don't want any messages popping up. But I don't necessarily want to disconnect either. I don't know why you'd want that feature, but that's the feature we're going to implement. So yeah, so you'll be able to choose your status as offline. Yeah, okay, let's do it that way. So I'm going to undo this change, and we're going to say instead of busy status will block all messages, we'll say offline status will block all messages. Change status, offline, available, busy, away. Okay. So now what does that mean? If we have the ability to choose a different status that makes us offline so that we no longer want to be able to receive any messages, well then from the specs perspective, when a message is received in the business layer, if we're offline, you know what we want to do here? So for new messages, oh, that's right. So okay. So I'm almost thinking now in terms of like actual chat programs that we're all probably really used to using, and thinking in terms of separate pop-ups perhaps for different conversations and that kind of thing. That's not in the spec, and I'm not planning on implementing that, at least not in part 1 or 2 anyway. So I was thinking if the user's status is not offline and the message matches the user's current filter criteria, then it's not just about appending the message to the message list, but actually being able to open a new pop-up or a new conversation or something like that, or even a toast notification or something like that. But that's very different from blocking the message entirely. So like in other words, if I choose the offline status, don't I still want to be able to receive messages in the window that receives messages? I mean, it's not going to change anything. If I'm doing a presentation, as long as maybe there's other semantics with the offline status, like it doesn't flash the window or something like that. But why not also still append the message? So this spec is maybe this feature, which I, again, threw in there just because I wanted something to do reactively. I was a little worried that maybe there wouldn't be enough reactive problems to solve. But this is just too weird for me. I don't want to implement it. Maybe there's some way to change this one to make it work. I think I'm just going to skip this for now, but we'll make a little mental note that, or if you have other ideas, I'd be happy to hear them out. Some way of just slightly changing this. I don't want to change it too far if we don't have to. Slightly changing it so that it makes sense, and then we could implement it as a nice business rule. Again, this is going to just be proof that, you know, if you have to go and maintain this feature in the future, hopefully it'll be a feature that actually makes sense to begin with anyway, then you'll be able to find it easily and maintain it easily. So it would be nice to have a nice example of that. So this is kind of what I was going for. So anyway, so we'll skip that for now, but obviously we're going to have some sort of new input observables to deal with status changes, and that will be part 2 anyway. But from the business layer perspective, if we could think of something to change that, actually even if you change that rule to the point where it makes more sense in a part 2, that's fine too. We could just implement it in part 2, but I was hoping to have something simpler in part 1, but anyway, doesn't matter. I think we're good where we are right now. I guess the next step would be to actually start thinking about how to implement the service layer, because I think our design, at least for our first iteration, is complete. So designing from the outside, we've done the presentation layer, the graphical interface that is, and the contracts for the business layer from the perspective of the presentation layer to the business layer, and vice versa. And then we define the contracts on the business layer, the input and output with respect to the presentation layer. And now we've just designed the contracts on or between, let's say, the business layer and the service layer, input and output, both directions. So now we'd want to actually start building it, right? We don't necessarily have to build the service yet. As a matter of fact, I'll probably do that later, because in order to test this, it might be easier to have some sort of random generation of messages or something like that. So kind of mocking things, but not for automated testing purposes, not necessarily anyway, but just because I want to start using the app and seeing messages come in and interacting with users, but there aren't any real users to use. Oops, forgot to delete the setter here. So there aren't any real users, that could use the app with me while I'm developing it, since I'm programming this alone. And also, even if you weren't, I think it's nice to have generators, that could generate messages and test your application that way manually. So I'll build that probably. But I think it's important to build from the inside out. So now that we have these designs, we don't have to actually jump to the service layer quite yet, but we could start actually implementing the service abstraction layer without the service, right? So it would be like the types that we would need to compose the observable inputs and the observable outputs from the business layer, to and from the business layer. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. So perhaps in the next video we'll do that. for this video, I'd like to come up with a challenge for you that might be interesting. Maybe that's a good enough challenge. Well, this I was thinking about this one actually. Maybe this is good enough as a challenge. It's not so much fun. I mean, it's not really writing code, but it is thinking in terms of the spec and thinking in terms of, if you can, in terms of reactive programming, what would be a nice feature to have that would require the business layer to have some, a nice rule that we could implement in the business layer. Like it would require the business layer to have a nice little query that glues together some of the inputs from the presentation layer, the user changing their status or something like that. So yeah, if you could figure out something for me, that would be great. I'd appreciate it. And I know that's not the best challenge, but we haven't really been learning much in the last few videos regarding how to use like reactive extensions, for example. But I think that's important that we've been doing it the way we've been doing it. I'm doing it this way because I think this is the proper way to build an app. So even though from the perspective of the video series, it's not quite the reactive programming introduction that you might have expected, although I tried to give you that in like the first and second videos, we will be getting back into that, right? At some point we will have to go back into this constructor and start building many more queries and start implementing all the rules that I've been discussing and composing together these observables. But again, we don't want to build the wrong thing, which is quite easy to do. So I don't want to drag this on any longer than it has to be. I'm not sure that it makes sense to go into anything else. I'm a little short of the hour that I like to do usually, but I think this was a fairly quick one, but it was important. And so in the next video, I think the plan is to start building from the inside out, right? So we'll jump to the service layer and make sure that these inputs and outputs would make sense if we had some kind of service implementation. And we'll just sort of mock it and build a generator or something like that. Maybe we'll start doing that. So I think it's nice to have the data first also, because then at least we could experiment easily, right? We could start changing the way our queries work. We could throw in a throttle and, we could do some stuff with timing or whatever. We could do some experimentation and see what the results are. Having a nice little generator allows us, to turn up the volume of messages, turn them down, and play around with it that way. And it's not, by the way, it's not going to be from the perspective of performance tuning. That's not what I want to do yet. That's something we'll do in the future. We care about correctness first, but it's fun to do that anyway, just because from the perspective of the UI, right? You want the app to behave in a certain way. It's not necessarily about performance, but perception. So that will be it for this video, and thanks for watching, and I hope you join me in the next one.